Every sunrise, a tiny girl in a wheelchair rolls across a gold-lined estate, crosses the gate her father built, and wraps her arms around a lonely boy sleeping on a splintered park bench. A diamond watch ticks. Security cameras zoom. The boy's empty stomach growls while the girl slips him half her breakfast. One hug turns into 30. The millionaire's patience snaps. He storms into the rain to drag his daughter home. But what he discovers about the boy shatters everything he thought he knew about trust, family, and fortune. Now the richest man on the block faces a choice that could wreck his empire, or save 3 broken hearts. Will he risk his legacy to do the unthinkable, or lose the only thing money can't buy? But before we begin, please hit the like button and let me know where in the world you're watching from today. It's always fascinating seeing who's joining us from around the world. The morning sun painted long shadows across the pristine lawns of the Hale estate. Its golden rays caught the iron gates, making them gleam like polished sentinels. Inside the mansion's kitchen, June sat in her small blue wheelchair, her hands folded neatly in her lap as she watched Rosa prepare breakfast. "Park today?" June asked softly, her eyes bright with hope. It was the same question she'd asked every morning for the past 3 weeks. Rosa glanced at the clock on the wall, then back at the little girl. "Of course, mi angelito. After breakfast, just like always." From his office window on the 2nd floor, Vincent stood with his coffee cup in hand, watching. His daughter's morning routine had become as predictable as the sunrise itself. He took a sip of the bitter liquid, his expression unchanged as he observed June eating her breakfast below, chatting quietly with Rosa. The housekeeper had worked for them since before the accident, before Sarah's death, before everything changed. Vincent's jaw tightened at the memories. He turned away from the window, focusing instead on the array of screens that dominated his desk. Downstairs, June finished her toast and carefully wiped her mouth with a napkin. "Ready," she announced, smoothing down her yellow dress. Rosa helped June with her light jacket, tucking a small pouch filled with snacks onto the side of the wheelchair. It had become part of their ritual. June always insisted on bringing extra food, though Rosa had never seen her eat any of it during their outings. The morning air was crisp as they made their way down the street. June's wheelchair hummed softly against the smooth sidewalk, her small hands resting on the armrests as Rosa pushed. The neighborhood was quiet at this hour, just the occasional jogger or dog walker who would wave as they passed. When they reached the park, the familiar path stretched before them, winding through carefully maintained flower beds and beneath spreading oak trees. June's eyes were fixed ahead, searching for something, or someone. There, on the worn wooden bench near the duck pond, was a small figure. The boy lay curled on his side, a ragged gray hoodie pulled up over his head. Even in sleep, his body seemed tense, ready to flee at a moment's notice. "Stop here, please," June said, her voice barely above a whisper. Rosa hesitated, her protective instincts warring with the pure trust she saw in June's eyes. The boy hadn't moved, hadn't shown any sign of threat during their previous encounters. But still, he was a stranger, a child alone in the park. June reached into her pouch and pulled out a granola bar, the wrapper crinkling slightly in her small hands. The sound was enough to make Elijah stir, his eyes opening slowly, warily scanning his surroundings before focusing on June. Without a word, June extended her arm, offering the granola bar. Elijah sat up slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. His dark eyes met June's, and something passed between them, an understanding that went beyond their young years. He accepted the granola bar with a slight nod, his fingers brushing against hers for just a moment. Then, before Rosa could process what was happening, June had leaned forward in her wheelchair, wrapping her arms around Elijah in a gentle hug. Rosa's heart caught in her throat. The boy remained perfectly still for a moment, his body rigid with surprise. But he didn't pull away. Instead, his shoulders relaxed slightly, just for a second, before June released him and settled back in her chair. Without another word, June nodded to Rosa, signaling she was ready to go. As they turned to leave, Rosa glanced back. Elijah sat watching them, the unopened granola bar held carefully in his hands, like something precious. The rest of their morning passed as usual, a loop around the duck pond, a few moments watching the fountain, Then the return journey home. June hummed quietly to herself, seeming content. That evening, the massive dining room felt especially empty as Vincent joined June for dinner. The long table could have seated 20, but father and daughter sat at opposite ends, the space between them filled with silence. Vincent's attention was divided between his plate and his phone, his fingers tapping out occasional messages while his food grew cold. "How was your day?" he asked finally, the question mechanical, part of their nightly routine. June looked up from her carefully arranged vegetables, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I saw my friend again," she said simply. Vincent's fork paused halfway to his mouth. He frowned but said nothing, returning to his meal without acknowledgement. The silence stretched between them once more, broken only by the quiet clink of silverware against china. Later that night, after June had been tucked into bed, Vincent sat in his darkened office. The blue glow from his monitors cast sharp shadows across his face as he accessed the security feed. The cameras he'd installed throughout the neighborhood gave him a clear view of the park. He rewound the footage, watching as the morning's events played out in reverse until he found what he was looking for. There, on the bench, the boy. Vincent leaned closer, his fingers moving across the keyboard to zoom in on the image. The security camera captured every detail: the worn shoes, the frayed edges of the hoodie, the careful way the boy held himself even in sleep. Vincent's expression remained unreadable as he studied the footage, his eyes fixed on the screen. With a sharp click, he shut off the monitor, plunging the office into darkness. The next morning arrived with a gentle pink sunrise, but June was already wide awake. Her small hands gripped her bedsheets as she listened for Rosa's familiar footsteps in the hallway. Unable to contain her excitement any longer, she reached for the bell on her nightstand, the one Rosa had given her for emergencies, and gave it a gentle ring. Within moments, Rosa appeared in the doorway, still tying her apron. "Mi angelito? What's wrong? It's not even 6 yet." "I want to get ready," June announced, pushing herself up to sit straighter against her pillows. Her determination shone in her bright eyes. "Can I dress myself today?" Rosa hesitated, glancing at the clock. They usually didn't leave for the park until after 8. "There's plenty of time, pequeña. Why don't you rest a little longer?" But June was already reaching for her dresser drawer. "Please, I can do it." Her voice carried that quiet certainty that sometimes made Rosa forget she was only 5. "All right," Rosa conceded, moving to help June into her wheelchair. "But I'll stay close just in case." June beamed, wheeling herself to her closet with practiced movements. She selected each item carefully: lavender leggings, a white sweater with tiny butterflies, and her special purple scarf. The scarf was a soft, flowing thing that June called her adventure scarf. It had been her mother's once. Rosa watched as June methodically dressed herself, offering help only when absolutely necessary. The little girl's face screwed up in concentration as she worked the buttons, but she didn't complain or ask for assistance. "Can we make a sandwich?" June asked once she was dressed, smoothing down her scarf with careful fingers. "For the park?" Rosa's brow furrowed. "A sandwich? But you'll have your breakfast first, yes?" "It's not for me," June said simply, her eyes earnest and pleading. Understanding dawned on Rosa's face. She studied June for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Okay, mi amor. We'll make something special." In the kitchen, Rosa helped June assemble a sandwich: turkey with cheese, lettuce, and just a touch of mayo. June insisted on wrapping it carefully in wax paper herself, her small fingers folding the corners with surprising precision. "Perfect," she declared, tucking it into her wheelchair pouch alongside her usual granola bars. The morning air was cooler than usual as they made their way to the park. June's purple scarf fluttered behind her like a banner, catching the early light. She sat straighter in her chair today, her eyes fixed ahead on their destination. When they reached the familiar bench by the duck pond, Elijah was already awake. He sat with his back straight, watching the ducks glide across the water's surface. His worn hoodie was pulled back today, revealing close-cropped black hair and alert, intelligent eyes. Rosa noticed something she hadn't before. Despite his raggedy clothes, Elijah himself was clean. His face and hands were washed, his nails neat. He carried himself with a quiet dignity that seemed far older than his years. June wheeled herself closer, not waiting for Rosa's help. "Hi," she said softly, reaching into her pouch to retrieve the sandwich. Elijah turned to look at her, his expression careful but not unkind. He accepted the sandwich with a small nod of thanks, just as he had done with the granola bars before. Then something new happened. Elijah stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and gentle, and stepped toward June. Rosa tensed instinctively, but there was no need. The boy simply bent down and gave June a quick, careful hug. June's face lit up with a smile that seemed to brighten the whole park. "I like hugs," she told him softly. "You don't have to talk." Elijah's expression softened just slightly at her words. He returned to his seat on the bench, unwrapping the sandwich with careful movements. Rosa noticed he didn't devour it immediately, instead taking small, measured bites as if making it last. Throughout their entire interaction, he never begged or asked for anything. He simply sat, watching the world with those watchful eyes, accepting what was freely given with quiet grace. When they returned home, Rosa found Vincent in his study, surrounded by his usual wall of screens and technology. She knocked softly on the doorframe. "Mr. Hale, do you have a moment?" Vincent looked up, his fingers pausing over his keyboard. "What is it, Rosa?" "It's about the boy at the park," she began, stepping into the room. "The one June visits." Vincent's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Go on." "He's very gentle with her," Rosa said carefully. "Clean, polite. He never asks for anything, never causes any trouble. But—" she hesitated, choosing her words. "He's so young to be alone." Vincent leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable. "Make sure she's not putting herself in danger," he said finally, his voice firm. "Kids like that don't end up on benches without a reason." He turned to one of his screens, pulling up a security interface. Rosa watched as he input commands, adding additional patrol routes around the park perimeter. "I won't stop her visits," he continued, not looking up from his work, "but will increase security in the area. Keep watching him carefully." Rosa nodded, understanding she was dismissed. As she closed the study door behind her, she could hear Vincent's fingers returning to their steady rhythm on the keyboard, programming new safeguards around his daughter's morning ritual. A week had passed and June's morning routine had settled into a comfortable rhythm that even the household staff could predict. At precisely 7:30, she would wheel herself to the breakfast table, already dressed in carefully chosen clothes and her purple adventure scarf. By 8, she would be in the kitchen with Rosa, methodically preparing a sandwich with the same careful attention most children reserved for building with blocks. "Turkey today?" Rosa would ask, though she already knew the answer. June would nod, her small fingers arranging lettuce with precision. "And cheese. He likes cheese." The "he" no longer needed explanation. Even the kitchen staff had grown accustomed to June's daily ritual of sandwich making, though they never commented on it directly. They simply made sure the ingredients were always fresh and within easy reach of her wheelchair. What none of them knew was that every morning, a black SUV with tinted windows would pull out of the garage shortly after June and Rosa left. Vincent, dressed in his usual impeccable suit, would drive slowly through the neighborhood's winding streets until he found a spot with a clear view of the park bench. Far enough to remain unnoticed, close enough to watch. Today was no different. Vincent adjusted his rearview mirror, watching as Rosa pushed June's wheelchair along the familiar path. His daughter's purple scarf fluttered in the morning breeze like a signal flag, making her easy to track even at this distance. From his vantage point, Vincent could see Elijah already at his usual spot. The boy sat with perfect posture, his worn hoodie pulled back despite the morning chill. Vincent noticed how Elijah's head turned slightly at their approach, alert but not startled, like he had been waiting. Through the tinted windows, Vincent observed their daily exchange. It never varied much. June would offer the sandwich, Elijah would accept with a small nod, and then there would be a brief, careful hug. The boy never lingered afterward, never tried to prolong the contact. He would simply return to his spot on the bench, eating his sandwich with measured bites while watching the ducks. But today was different. Vincent sat up straighter in his seat as he noticed Elijah reach into his hoodie pocket after finishing his sandwich. The boy's movements were deliberate as he pulled something small out and held it toward June. Vincent's hand moved instinctively toward his phone, ready to call security, but he forced himself to wait, watching as June accepted whatever it was with visible delight. Even from this distance, he could see it was a rock, ordinary at first glance, but as June turned it in her hands, morning sunlight caught swirls of purple paint decorating its surface. The color matched her scarf exactly. June clutched the painted rock to her chest like it was made of gold, her smile bright enough to be visible even from Vincent's position down the street. Elijah's expression remained serious, but Vincent thought he caught the slightest softening around the boy's eyes as he watched June's reaction. The exchange ended as it always did, with a quick hug and June waving goodbye as Rosa wheeled her back toward home. Elijah remained on his bench, returning to his quiet observation of the duck pond. Vincent stayed parked for several minutes after they left, watching the boy. His suspicion, which had begun to fade over the past week of observation, stirred again. The painted rock bothered him. It suggested planning, forethought. Why would a homeless child take the time to paint a rock? And why that specific shade of purple? That evening, after June had gone to bed, Rosa moved quietly through her room doing her usual nighttime check. She found June fast asleep, one small hand still wrapped tightly around the purple-painted rock. Rosa gently worked it free from June's grasp, careful not to wake her. She studied the rock in the soft glow of the nightlight. The purple swirls were surprisingly delicate, almost artistic in their execution. Whoever had painted it had taken great care with the design. Rosa placed it carefully on the nightstand where June would see it first thing in the morning. Meanwhile, in his study, Vincent sat surrounded by the blue glow of multiple monitors. On the central screen was a high-resolution image of Elijah's face, captured from that morning's surveillance footage. The boy's features were clear, serious dark eyes, high cheekbones, and an expression that seemed too old for his young face. Vincent's fingers moved across his keyboard with practiced efficiency, running the image through various facial recognition databases. He had connections that gave him access to systems most civilians couldn't touch, but screen after screen returned the same result. No match found. He leaned back in his chair, frowning at the image. In today's world of universal surveillance and digital footprints, finding absolutely no trace of someone was almost more suspicious than finding something negative. Every child should have school records, medical records, something. But this boy was a ghost. Vincent zoomed in on Elijah's face again, studying those careful eyes. The boy's gaze seemed to look right through the camera, as if he knew he was being watched and accepted it with the same quiet dignity with which he accepted June's sandwiches. The facial recognition program blinked one final time. No match found. Vincent's frown deepened as he stared at those words. In his experience, people without pasts usually had something to hide. But then he remembered the gentle way Elijah handled June's hugs, the carefully painted rock, the fact that in a week of surveillance the boy had never once done anything to justify Vincent's suspicion. Still, he left the search running as he turned to other work. The monitors cast their blue glow across his face as his fingers returned to their steady rhythm on the keyboard, the image of Elijah's unmatched face still visible in the corner of his screen. Gray clouds hung low over the Hale estate, releasing a steady drizzle that painted everything in muted tones. The usual morning bustle in the kitchen had a different energy today, as Rosa tried to reason with an increasingly frustrated June. "Mija, look at the weather," Rosa said, gesturing to the rain-streaked windows. "Maybe today we stay inside, yes? We can draw, or read your favorite stories." June shook her head firmly, her hands already busy preparing the daily sandwich. "He'll be cold," she said, her small voice filled with determination. "He needs breakfast more when it's cold." Rosa sighed, watching June carefully wrap the sandwich in wax paper. The little girl had already dressed herself in a yellow raincoat over her usual clothes, her purple scarf peeking out beneath it. The sight would have been endearing if Rosa wasn't so worried about taking her out in this weather. "June, sweetheart, your chair could slip on the wet paths. It's not safe today." Vincent's voice cut through their discussion. He stood in the kitchen doorway, still in his house robe, a tablet in one hand. His expression was firm, but not unkind as he looked at his daughter. June's lower lip trembled. "But Daddy, the paths will be slippery," Vincent continued, his tone measured and reasonable. "And the bench will be wet. We need to think about what's best for—" The first tear rolled down June's cheek, followed quickly by others. Her small shoulders shook as she tried to hold back sobs. "He'll be all alone," she managed between hitching breaths, "in the cold and hungry." Vincent's composed expression wavered. He looked from his crying daughter to Rosa, then back to June. The rain tapped against the windows, a steady rhythm that seemed to match the tension in the room. After what felt like a very long moment, Vincent's shoulders dropped slightly. "Rosa," he said, his voice softer now. "Take an umbrella. Stay on the paved paths only." June's tears stopped almost immediately. She looked up at her father with such gratitude that Vincent had to look away, busying himself with his tablet. Rosa quickly gathered their rain gear, including a large black umbrella that could cover both June's wheelchair and herself. As they prepared to leave, Vincent called out one last time. 30 minutes, he said. No longer. The rain created a gentle percussion on the umbrella as Rosa pushed June's wheelchair along the familiar route to the park. The paths were indeed slick, forcing Rosa to move more slowly than usual. June didn't seem to mind the pace, her eyes fixed ahead, searching. When they reached their usual spot, Rosa's heart sank. The old wooden bench was dark with rain, water dripping steadily from its edges. But Elijah was there, just as he always was. The boy sat perfectly still, his hoodie soaked through. Water ran in rivulets down his face, but he didn't seem bothered by it. His eyes were focused on the duck pond, where a few brave ducks still paddled through the rain. As soon as he heard June's wheelchair approaching, Elijah stood up. His movements were careful on the wet ground as he reached down beside the bench and picked up a large piece of cardboard. It was relatively dry, protected by the bench until now. Before Rosa could process what was happening, Elijah stepped toward them, holding the cardboard above his head. He positioned himself so it would shield June from any rain that might blow under their umbrella. June looked up at him, then held out the carefully wrapped sandwich. But instead of taking it immediately, Elijah shook his head and offered her the umbrella. His gesture was clear. He wanted them to take it. Rosa watched, amazed, as June firmly shook her head back at him. "You need it more," she said softly. Elijah's expression didn't change, but his eyes seemed to soften. He lowered the cardboard just long enough to accept the sandwich with one hand, then immediately raised it again to protect June from the rain. Their usual hug was briefer today, just a quick embrace before Elijah stepped back, still holding his makeshift shield. Water immediately began soaking through the cardboard, but he maintained his position until Rosa had turned June's wheelchair around and started back down the path. When Rosa glanced back, Elijah had returned to his spot on the bench. The cardboard shield lay forgotten on the ground as he ate his sandwich, rain running down his face, his gaze once again fixed on the duck pond. That evening, the usual quiet of dinner in the Hale household felt heavier than normal. June pushed her food around her plate, her expression thoughtful. Vincent, who had been checking his phone between bites, gradually became aware of his daughter's unusual silence. He set his phone down. "June, is everything all right?" She looked up at him, her face serious. "He was wetter than me," she said finally, "but he didn't want to make me cold." Vincent's fork paused halfway to his mouth. He lowered it slowly, but said nothing. "He tried to keep me dry," June continued, her voice small but clear in the dining room silence, "even though he was already so wet." Vincent remained quiet, his expression unreadable as he studied his daughter's face. After a moment, he simply nodded and returned to his meal. But his movements were mechanical now, distracted. Hours later, long after June had been tucked into bed, Vincent stood at his office window. The rain continued to fall, creating patterns on the glass that his fingers absently traced. His reflection stared back at him, superimposed over the dark, wet landscape of his estate. Tap, tap, tap. His fingers moved against the cool glass, matching the rhythm of the rain. His expression remained as unreadable as it had been at dinner, but his eyes never left the direction of the park, hidden now behind the curtain of rain and darkness. Morning light filtered through June's bedroom curtains, casting soft shadows on her pink walls. She stirred beneath her unicorn-patterned blanket, and a small cough escaped her lips. Rosa, who had been quietly arranging June's clothes for the day, turned at the sound. "Good morning, Mija," Rosa said, moving to June's bedside. She pressed her palm gently against the little girl's forehead. "How are you feeling?" June pushed herself up, her dark hair tousled from sleep. "I'm okay," she said, though another light cough followed her words. She was already reaching for her purple scarf, which hung on the bedpost. Rosa caught June's hand mid-reach. "Maybe today we rest, yes? Just one day to make sure you don't get sick from yesterday's rain." "But I'm fine," June insisted, her voice rising slightly. She pulled her hand free and grabbed the scarf, clutching it to her chest. "Really, Rosa, I promise, it's just a little cough." In the hallway, Vincent paused outside June's door. He'd been on his way to his home office when he heard the exchange. His hand tightened around his coffee mug as another of June's coughs echoed through the door. "June, please," Rosa was saying, "one day of rest won't—" Vincent pushed the door open, his presence immediately filling the room. Both June and Rosa fell silent, looking up at him. He set his coffee mug down on June's dresser with deliberate slowness. "You're not going to the park today," he said. His voice was quiet but firm. "Or any other day." June's eyes widened. "What? But Daddy—" "This ends now," Vincent continued, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You will not see that boy anymore." "But why?" June's voice trembled, her fingers twisting in her purple scarf. "He never hurt me. He's my friend." Vincent's jaw tightened. He looked at Rosa, who quickly busied herself with straightening June's blanket. "Rosa, would you give us a moment?" The housekeeper nodded and slipped out of the room, closing the door softly behind her. Vincent pulled June's desk chair closer to the bed and sat down, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "June," he began, his voice softer now but still resolute. "I know you think you're helping, but there are things you don't understand. Things that could be dangerous." "Elijah isn't dangerous," June protested. Her small face was set in determination, despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "He's nice. He shares his drawings with me, and yesterday he tried to keep me dry even though he was all wet." "You don't know people like I do," Vincent said, running a hand through his hair. "You don't know where he came from, or why he's alone, or what he might—" He stopped himself, straightening in the chair. "It's not safe, and that's final." June stared at her father, her lower lip trembling. "But he'll be alone," she whispered, "and hungry." "That's not our concern." Vincent stood up, retrieving his coffee mug. "There are proper channels for helping people in his situation. I'll make some calls." June didn't respond. She sat perfectly still, her hands still gripping her purple scarf, as Vincent walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the doorknob, looking back at his daughter. "This is for your own good, June," he said. "You'll understand when you're older." The day passed in unusual silence. June allowed Rosa to help her dress and move to her wheelchair, but she didn't speak. She didn't ask for stories during lunch, or to go out to the garden, or to draw with her favorite markers. She just sat by her bedroom window watching the clouds move across the sky. When dinner time arrived, Rosa wheeled June to the dining room. Vincent was already seated at the head of the table, his laptop open beside his plate despite his usual rule about no electronics during meals. He closed it as June approached her spot at the table. "I had the chef make your favorite," Vincent said, gesturing to the plate of mac and cheese in front of June. "With the extra cheese on top, just how you like it." June looked at the plate but made no move to pick up her fork. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out something small. With deliberate care, she placed the purple swirled rock that Elijah had given her in the center of the table. Vincent stared at the rock, his expression frozen. The painted swirls caught the light from the chandelier above, making them seem to move across the stone's surface. "I'm not hungry," June whispered. Without waiting for a response, she gripped her wheelchair's wheels and turned herself around, rolling away from the table. Vincent remained seated, his eyes fixed on the small rock. The sound of June's wheelchair faded as she disappeared down the hallway. After a long moment, he reached out and picked up the stone, turning it over in his palm. The paint was carefully applied, each swirl precise despite the crude materials likely used to create it. Later that night, after the house had grown quiet and June was asleep, Vincent sat in his office. The purple rock sat on his desk beside his keyboard as he typed out an email to his head of security. "Effective immediately," he wrote, "increase surveillance at the park. I want 2 guards on rotation at all times. If the boy returns, report to me immediately. Do not approach or engage unless he poses an immediate threat." He hit send, then leaned back in his chair, picking up the rock again. In the dim light of his desk lamp, the purple swirls seemed to hold questions he couldn't answer. He placed it in his desk drawer, closing it firmly, as if hiding the rock could also hide the doubt growing in his mind. The morning sun crept through June's window, painting warm squares of light across her pink bedspread. She lay curled on her side, facing the wall, her purple scarf clutched tightly in her small fists. The breakfast tray Rosa had brought in sat untouched on the nightstand, the scrambled eggs growing cold. "Mija," Rosa said softly, perching on the edge of June's bed. "Your toast is getting cold. And remember, today is therapy day with Miss Sarah. She always brings those special stickers you like." June didn't move. Her shoulders were tight under her pajama top, her dark hair tangled from a restless night. Rosa reached out to smooth the messy strands, but June shifted away from the touch. "How about we try something different today?" Rosa suggested, trying to keep her voice bright. "There's a lovely park near the library. It has ducks too, and a beautiful garden with butterflies." June's fingers tightened around her scarf, but she remained silent. The only sound in the room was the gentle ticking of her butterfly clock on the wall. "June, please," Rosa whispered, her cheerful facade cracking slightly. "Just a little breakfast? For me?" When June still didn't respond, Rosa stood up with a quiet sigh. She adjusted the blanket around June's shoulders, then moved to open the curtains wider. Morning light flooded the room, but June didn't even blink. In his home office, Vincent was having trouble focusing on his video conference. His eyes kept drifting to the security feed showing June's room, where he could see his daughter still hadn't moved from her bed. The CEO on his screen was discussing quarterly projections, but Vincent barely heard the words. "Mr. Hale?" The voice finally broke through his distraction. "Your thoughts on the Asian market expansion?" Vincent cleared his throat. "I'll need to review the numbers more thoroughly before making a decision. Send me the full report, and we'll reconvene next week." He ended the call before anyone could object. Leaning back in his chair, Vincent pulled up the footage from the past few days. June's room, the playroom, the garden, all showed the same thing. His daughter, usually so full of quiet energy, had become a shadow of herself. Her favorite stuffed elephant sat untouched in the corner. Her coloring books remained closed. The questions she normally peppered throughout the day, about clouds, about birds, about why leaves changed colors, had stopped completely. The intercom buzzed. "Mr. Hale?" His assistant's voice came through. "Miss Sarah, June's therapist, is on line 1. She says it's important." Vincent picked up the phone. "Sarah, what's wrong? Is June okay?" "Physically, yes." Sarah's familiar voice was gentle but concerned. "But Rosa just called to cancel today's session. She says June won't get out of bed. This isn't like her, Vincent. From what I'm hearing, these behavior changes, the withdrawal, the loss of interest in activities, the silence, they're consistent with grief responses I've seen in children." Vincent's free hand clenched on his desk. "Grief? That's ridiculous. She's just being stubborn." "Children process loss differently than adults," Sarah continued carefully. "Sometimes what we see as a small change can feel enormous to them. Has anything significant happened recently? Any changes to her routine? Vincent's eyes drifted to his desk drawer where the purple swirled rock still sat hidden. No, he said firmly. Nothing significant. After ending the call, Vincent sat in silence, staring at the security feed. June hadn't moved. Rosa was trying again to coax her to eat, but his daughter remained curled away from the world, lost in her own quiet pain. A soft knock at his office door interrupted his thoughts. Rosa entered, carrying a tray with his afternoon coffee. Her usual warm smile was absent. "Your coffee, Mr. Hale," she said, setting down the tray. She hesitated, then added quietly, "You took away the one thing that made her smile." Vincent's head snapped up. "Excuse me?" Rosa met his gaze steadily. "Since her mother..." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Since the accident, I haven't seen June truly happy. Not until she started visiting that bench. Not until she found someone who needed her help as much as she needed to give it." "That boy was dangerous," Vincent insisted, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. "Was he?" Rosa asked simply. "Or was he just alone, like June feels now?" She left Vincent with his cooling coffee and his thoughts. The afternoon stretched into evening, marked by more missed meals and continued silence from June's room. Vincent buried himself in work, but every few minutes his eyes would drift to the security feed, hoping to see some change in his daughter's position. Night fell over the Hale estate. Vincent's footsteps echoed in the quiet hallway as he made his final rounds before bed, a habit he'd developed after losing his wife. As he approached June's room, he noticed the door was slightly ajar, a thin line of moonlight spilling into the hall. He slowed his steps, then stopped completely when he heard June's voice, the first sounds she'd made all day. It was barely a whisper, meant only for herself and the darkness. "I hope he's not cold." Vincent's chest tightened. He looked past the door to where June's wheelchair sat untouched against the wall, its purple cushion collecting dust. For a long moment, he stood frozen in the hallway, one hand raised as if to push the door open, but he couldn't make himself move forward or backward. June's soft voice came again, even quieter than before. "Please be okay, Elijah." Vincent's hand slowly lowered to his side. The moonlight caught the silver wedding band he still wore, reminding him of another loss, another pain he couldn't fix. He stood there for what felt like hours, listening to his daughter's whispered prayers for a boy he'd driven away. Finally, Vincent forced himself to move, continuing down the hallway toward his own room, but each step felt heavier than the last, weighted down by the sound of his daughter's broken heart echoing in his ears. Morning sunlight streamed through Vincent's bedroom windows as he methodically buttoned his crisp white shirt. His fingers moved automatically while his mind wandered elsewhere. The house felt different lately, heavier, quieter. Even the morning birds seemed to sing more softly. He pulled his phone from its charging station and began typing, "Cancel all meetings until noon." His thumb hovered over the send button for a moment before pressing it firmly. Another message followed to his assistant. "Reschedule everything. Personal matter." The halls echoed with his footsteps as he made his way to the kitchen. Rosa was there, preparing June's breakfast, though most meals lately had gone untouched. "Rosa," Vincent said, his voice carefully controlled. "Would you take June somewhere today? Somewhere different? Maybe that butterfly garden you mentioned." Rosa looked up from the toast she was buttering, surprise clear on her face. "Of course, Mr. Hale, but..." She hesitated. She hasn't wanted to leave her room. "Try anyway," Vincent said. He adjusted his tie, a nervous habit he'd never quite broken. "She needs fresh air." After Rosa disappeared upstairs, Vincent stood in the kitchen's silence. Through the window, he could see his usual car waiting, the driver ready to take him to the office. Instead, he reached for his personal keys, the ones to the old Audi he rarely drove anymore. The garage door hummed open and Vincent slipped behind the wheel. No tinted windows, no security detail. Just him and the morning air streaming through the cracked window. He couldn't remember the last time he'd driven himself anywhere. The park wasn't far, just a few winding streets through the neighborhood. Vincent had seen it countless times through cameras and tinted glass, but somehow it looked different now. More real, more alive. The morning dew still clung to the grass and the pond's surface rippled with tiny waves. He parked on the street, away from his usual surveillance spot. As he walked down the path, his expensive shoes crunched on gravel, a sound that seemed too loud in the quiet morning. And there, just as the security feeds had shown him every day, was the boy. Elijah sat at the pond's edge, legs crossed, tossing small pebbles into the water. Each one made perfect ripples that spread out in ever-widening circles. His hoodie was pulled up, but Vincent could see it was clean. Worn, but cared for. The boy's movements were deliberate, careful, like someone used to making each action count. Vincent approached slowly, his shadow eventually falling across the water. Elijah didn't turn around, but his shoulders tensed slightly. He knew who was there. Taking a deep breath, Vincent moved to the bench, not June's usual one, but another facing the pond. He sat down, his usual commanding presence feeling somehow diminished in this simple setting. "Why does she come here?" Vincent's voice was quieter than he'd intended. Elijah's hand paused mid-throw, pebble caught between his fingers. "I don't know," he said, his voice clear but soft. "I didn't ask her to." The words hung in the morning air. A duck paddled past, creating its own ripples that intersected with the fading circles from Elijah's pebbles. "Why do you let her?" Vincent found himself asking. The question had been burning in his mind for weeks. Elijah's shoulder moved in a small shrug. He tossed another pebble, watching it skip once before sinking. "She's kind," he said simply. Then, after a pause, "Nobody else sees me. She does." The words hit Vincent harder than he expected. He remembered June's first words about Elijah. "I saw my friend again. Not met or found, but saw." The morning air grew warmer as the sun climbed higher. Elijah stood up, brushing off his worn jeans. He turned toward the path, but then stopped. Looking back over his shoulder, his dark eyes met Vincent's directly for the first time. "You're lucky she still tries with you." The words landed like the final pebble in the pond, sending ripples through Vincent's carefully constructed world. He watched Elijah walk away, his small figure disappearing around the bend in the path. Vincent remained on the bench, feeling its rough wood through his expensive suit. Across the pond, a mother arrived with her young daughter. They carried a bag of breadcrumbs, and the little girl's laughter echoed across the water as she threw handfuls to the eager ducks. Sitting there, watching this simple scene of joy, Vincent felt suddenly out of place. His polished shoes, his tailored suit, his carefully maintained image, none of it belonged here in this moment of real life. He was as invisible as Elijah had been, but for entirely different reasons. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawn of the Hale estate as Vincent's Audi pulled into the circular driveway. His morning at the park had left him feeling oddly unsettled, like someone had rearranged all his furniture by just a few inches. Everything looked the same, but felt different. Through the kitchen window, he spotted Rosa in the garden tending to the herbs she used for cooking. Her gray-streaked hair was tied back in a neat bun, and she hummed softly as she worked. The sight was so normal, so peaceful, that it made the tension in Vincent's shoulders ease slightly. He stepped out onto the stone path that led to the garden. Rosa looked up at the sound of his footsteps, surprise flickering across her weathered features. It wasn't often that Vincent sought her out directly. "How was she today?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. Rosa straightened up, wiping her hands on her apron. "Quiet, mostly. She didn't want to go to the butterfly garden." She paused, then added, "But she did draw something." Vincent's eyebrows lifted slightly. June hadn't drawn anything in days. Rosa reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She worked on it all morning. Vincent took the paper, unfolding it carefully. The drawing was done in crayon, showing a simple but clear map of the park. There was the pond, colored in bright blue, and the winding path in brown. In the center, near the familiar bench, June had drawn two stick figures. One sat in a wheelchair, topped with yellow hair. The other stood beside it, colored in brown crayon, with a simple letter E written above it. His fingers traced the crayon lines, feeling the slight indentations in the paper where June had pressed harder with certain colors. The two figures were connected by what looked like arms reaching toward each other, a hug frozen in crayon. Vincent folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket. "Thank you, Rosa." The rest of the afternoon passed slowly. Vincent tried to work in his home office, but his eyes kept drifting to the folded drawing in his pocket. The simple crayon lines seemed to carry more weight than all the contracts and spreadsheets on his computer screen. When dinner time arrived, Vincent made his way to the dining room. June was already there, sitting in her wheelchair at her usual place. Her plate held the same untouched food as the previous nights. Her purple adventure scarf lay crumpled in her lap, unworn. Vincent sat down across from her, studying his daughter's face. The usual sparkle in her eyes had dimmed over the past week, like a light switched off. He thought about what Elijah had said at the park. "You're lucky she still tries with you." "What do you like about him?" Vincent asked suddenly, breaking the silence. June's head snapped up, her eyes widening slightly. It was the first time Vincent had mentioned Elijah directly, without using phrases like, "that boy," or "him." Color crept back into her cheeks as she considered the question. "He listens without talking," she said softly, her fingers playing with the edge of her scarf. Then, after a pause, she added, "He doesn't make me feel like a broken doll." The words hit Vincent like a physical blow. He remembered all the doctor's appointments, the therapists, the endless stream of well-meaning specialists who always spoke about June as if she wasn't in the room. Even he had done it, focusing so much on what she couldn't do that he'd forgotten to see what she could. Vincent set down his fork, the silver making a soft clink against the fine china. The sound seemed to echo in the quiet room. He took a deep breath, then spoke quietly. "Would you like to see him again?" June's reaction was instant. She nodded, her whole body seeming to come alive with hope. The light that had been missing from her eyes flickered back to life. That night, Vincent barely slept. He kept thinking about June's drawing, about Elijah's quiet dignity at the park, about his daughter's words. "He doesn't make me feel like a broken doll." The next morning dawned clear and cool. June was already dressed when Rosa came to get her, the purple scarf tied carefully around her neck. Vincent met them in the foyer, dressed more casually than usual in a simple sweater and slacks. They made their way down the familiar path to the park, Rosa pushing June's wheelchair while Vincent walked beside them. His steps were measured, deliberate, like someone walking into unknown territory. The morning sun sparkled on the pond's surface as they approached the bench. Elijah was already there, standing straight and still. When he saw them, his posture shifted slightly, not tensing, but adjusting, like a wild animal deciding whether to stay or flee. June's face bloomed into a smile, the first real one Vincent had seen in a week. It transformed her entire face, bringing back the daughter he remembered from before the rain, before the rules, before his fear had built walls around her joy. Vincent stopped a few paces back, watching as Rosa wheeled June forward. Elijah moved toward them, his movements careful but certain. He knelt down beside June's wheelchair, bringing himself to her eye level. "I missed you," he said softly, wrapping his arms around her in a gentle hug. Vincent stood back, hands in his pockets, watching the simple reunion unfold. The morning light caught the purple threads in June's scarf, making them shimmer like tiny stars. For the first time, he didn't see danger in the scene before him. He saw healing. Back at the Hale estate, sunlight streamed through the tall dining room windows, casting warm patterns across the marble floor. June sat at the breakfast table, her whole body practically vibrating with renewed energy. Her wheelchair, which had seemed like a prison these past few days, now moved with her animated gestures as she spoke. "And then," June continued, her voice bright and clear, "Elijah showed me a new duck family. There's 5 baby ducks now, Rosa." Her hands spread wide to demonstrate. "They're so tiny, like little yellow cotton balls." Rosa smiled warmly as she set down a plate of fresh fruit in front of June. The girl's appetite had returned. She'd already finished her scrambled eggs, something she hadn't done in days. The purple scarf around her neck caught the morning light, making it seem to glow. Vincent sat at the head of the table, his usual spot, watching the scene unfold. His coffee cup sat untouched, growing cold as he observed his daughter's transformation. The change was striking, like someone had turned on all the lights in a dark room. June's eyes sparkled as she described every detail of her morning visit, her hands dancing through the air as she spoke. "He remembered my favorite color is purple," June said, touching her scarf. "He found a purple flower by the pond and showed it to me. He said it was just for looking, not picking, because then other people couldn't enjoy it too." She beamed at this piece of wisdom, clearly treasuring it. Vincent's expression remained carefully neutral, but his eyes never left his daughter's face. He noticed how her cheeks had regained their color, how her smile reached her eyes again. It was like watching a wilted flower slowly straighten its stem after being watered. When June finally paused to eat some strawberries, Vincent caught Rosa's eye and gave a subtle nod. Understanding immediately, Rosa waited until June was distracted by her fruit before moving to Vincent's side. "Rosa," he said quietly, his voice low enough that June couldn't hear. "I need to speak with the boy, directly, without June present." Rosa's eyebrows lifted slightly, but she nodded. "She usually naps after lunch," she whispered back. "I could go to the park then." Vincent gave a short nod. "Bring him to the front gates. I'll meet him there." The morning passed quickly, filled with June's renewed chatter and energy. After lunch, she fell asleep easily, worn out from her excitement. Rosa waited until she was certain June was sleeping soundly before slipping out to the park. When she returned, Elijah walked beside her, his worn hoodie pulled tight around his thin frame. His face was composed, showing neither anxiety nor excitement at being invited to the estate. He moved with the careful awareness of someone used to watching their surroundings. Vincent waited by the tall iron gates, dressed in his usual impeccable suit. He'd positioned himself deliberately, not too close to appear threatening, but not so far as to seem distant. The contrast between the two males was stark: wealth and poverty, power and vulnerability, control and freedom. "Thank you for coming," Vincent said, his voice professionally neutral. He reached into a bag beside him and pulled out several items: new clothes, still in their packaging, several containers of prepared food, and an envelope that clearly contained money. He placed them on a nearby stone bench. "These are for you." Elijah looked at the items, then back at Vincent. His arms crossed over his chest, not defensively, but decisively. "I don't want your stuff," he said simply. Vincent's jaw tightened slightly. "You being near my daughter isn't safe," he said, his voice taking on an edge. "What do you want from her?" Elijah met Vincent's gaze steadily. For an 8-year-old, his eyes held an unsettling wisdom. "Nothing," he answered calmly. Then, after a pause, he added, "But she needs someone real." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Vincent's expression flickered: surprise, confusion, perhaps even a touch of anger. But before he could respond, Elijah turned and walked away, his steps unhurried but purposeful. He didn't look back at the offered items, leaving them untouched on the bench. Rosa, who had been watching silently from a respectful distance, moved to gather the rejected gifts. Vincent stopped her with a raised hand. "Leave them," he said quietly. He made his choice. That evening, Vincent sat in his home office, the screens of his security system casting a blue glow across his face. His fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency, accessing files, opening folders. On one screen, footage from the park played silently, June and Elijah at their bench, Rosa watching nearby, the daily visits that had become so routine. Vincent's finger hovered over the delete key. For a moment, he hesitated, years of careful control and monitoring warring with something new, something uncomfortable but insistent. Then, with a decisive click, he erased it all. The screens went dark, reflecting his own face back at him. Later that night, he passed by June's room. The door was slightly ajar, allowing a strip of hallway light to fall across her sleeping form. Vincent paused, looking in. June's wheelchair sat empty by her bed, her purple scarf draped carefully over its back. On her bedside table, 2 items flanked her lamp. On one side, a framed photograph of her mother, smiling and vibrant before the accident. On the other side, sat the purple swirled rock Elijah had given her, placed with obvious care and intention. Vincent stared at the arrangement for a long moment. The rock and the photograph, past and present, loss and finding, endings and beginnings, balanced on either side of his daughter's dreams. The morning sun painted warm squares on the kitchen floor as June finished her breakfast. She'd been pushing her scrambled eggs around thoughtfully, gathering courage. Vincent sat at the head of the table, absorbed in his tablet, occasionally sipping his coffee. "Daddy?" June's voice was soft but clear. Vincent looked up, his fingers pausing over the screen. "Yes?" June straightened in her wheelchair, her hands folded neatly in her lap, a gesture that made her look older than her 5 years. "Could Elijah come over for lunch? Just once?" The tablet lowered slowly to the table. Vincent's face tightened almost imperceptibly. "No, June, that's not possible." "But why?" June's voice wavered slightly. "He's my friend." "He's a stranger," Vincent said firmly. "We don't know anything about him." "I know things about him," June protested. "He likes birds and purple and he's good at drawing." "June," Vincent's tone carried a note of finality. "I said no." Rosa, who had been quietly loading the dishwasher, turned around. Her movements were deliberate as she wiped her hands on her apron. "Mr. Hale," she said, her voice respectful but steady. "May I speak?" Vincent's eyebrows lifted slightly, but he nodded. "That boy," Rosa began, moving closer to the table, "has been seeing June for weeks now. Not once has he asked for anything. Not money, not food, not even when he was soaking wet in the rain." She glanced at June, who was watching with wide eyes. Maybe he's the first person June chose on her own. The kitchen fell silent. June's fingers twisted in her lap, hope visible in every line of her small body. Vincent's jaw worked silently, as if chewing on words he couldn't quite swallow. "The answer is still no," he said finally, standing up. "I have meetings all day. Rosa, please ensure June stays on schedule with her therapy exercises." He left the kitchen, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor. June's shoulders slumped, but Rosa gave her a gentle pat on the shoulder as she cleared the breakfast plates. Later that afternoon, while Vincent's voice drifted from his office in the cadence of a virtual meeting, Rosa wheeled June down the familiar path to the park. The air was warm, carrying the sweet scent of blooming flowers. June wore her purple scarf as always, and carried her small backpack filled with crayons and paper. They found Elijah in his usual spot. Today he sat cross-legged on the ground, watching a sparrow hop along the path. When he saw them approach, he stood up, brushing off his worn jeans. "Would you like to join us?" Rosa asked, gesturing to a shady spot under a large oak tree. She was already spreading out a checkered blanket on the grass. "We brought a little picnic." Elijah hesitated, his eyes darting between Rosa and June. But June was already smiling, pulling out containers from her backpack. "Please?" she asked. "I brought extra sandwiches." Slowly, Elijah nodded. He settled onto the blanket, keeping a polite distance, but close enough to be part of their small circle. Rosa unpacked lunch, turkey sandwiches cut into triangles, apple slices, and cookies she'd baked that morning. June handed Elijah one of her sandwiches wrapped carefully in wax paper. "I told Rosa you liked the crusts on," she said proudly. "I remembered from last time." A tiny smile tugged at the corner of Elijah's mouth. He accepted the sandwich with a quiet, "Thank you." They ate in comfortable silence, broken only by the rustle of leaves above and the distant calls of birds. June pulled out her crayons, spreading them on the blanket between them. After a moment's consideration, she picked up her favorite purple one and held it out to Elijah. He took it gently, as if handling something precious. His eyes scanned the ground until he found a clean napkin. With careful strokes, he began to draw. June and Rosa watched as lines emerged. The curved wing of a bird, delicate feathers, a sharp little beak. The purple crayon moved with surprising skill in his small hands. When he finished, he passed the napkin to June. Her face lit up as she studied the drawing. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "Look, Rosa. It looks just like the sparrow from earlier." Rosa leaned over to admire the sketch. "You have quite a talent," she said warmly to Elijah. He ducked his head, but that small smile appeared again. The afternoon light was starting to soften when Rosa finally packed up their picnic. June carefully tucked the napkin with the bird drawing into her backpack, treating it like a treasure. They said goodbye to Elijah, who stood watching until they disappeared down the path. When they returned home, Vincent was waiting in the foyer. His arms were crossed, his expression stern. "I said no guests," he said, his voice clipped. Rosa helped June out of her wheelchair and onto the couch for her afternoon therapy exercises before turning to face Vincent. Her voice was quiet, but firm. "Then maybe talk to your daughter instead of everyone else." Vincent's mouth opened, then closed. Rosa continued past him to the kitchen, leaving him standing there without a response. That evening, after June had gone to bed, Vincent found himself in her therapy room, gathering her things to prepare for tomorrow's session. As he picked up her backpack, something fluttered to the floor, a napkin slightly crumpled from its journey home. He bent to retrieve it, his fingers automatically moving to smooth out the wrinkles. The purple crayon strokes caught the light, bringing the bird to life on the simple white surface. Vincent stared at it for a long moment, taking in the careful details, the confident lines, the obvious skill behind the childish medium. Slowly, deliberately, he smoothed the napkin completely flat, his hands lingering over each crease until it disappeared. Then he placed it carefully back in June's backpack, making sure it wouldn't wrinkle again. The morning sun warmed the park bench as June waited in her wheelchair, her purple scarf fluttering gently in the breeze. Rosa sat nearby on a wooden bench, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on what looked like a winter scarf. The park was quiet except for the occasional birdsong and the rustle of leaves in the trees. June spotted Elijah first, her face brightening as he approached from his usual direction near the pond. Today was different, though. Instead of coming empty-handed, he carried something tucked under his arm, a book with a worn blue cover, its edges frayed and soft from use. "Good morning," June said, her voice warm with welcome. Elijah gave her his usual quiet nod, but there was something different in his expression today. A hint of nervousness, maybe even excitement. He stopped in front of her wheelchair and carefully pulled out the book. The cover was creased and slightly water-stained, but the title was still clear, The Lonely Fox's Friend. Some of the pages were dog-eared, and a small tear ran down the spine, but June looked at it like it was made of gold. "Is that for me?" she asked, her eyes wide. Elijah nodded, then spoke softly. "I thought maybe I could read it to you?" June's smile grew even brighter. She patted the grass beside her wheelchair, where Rosa had already spread out a blanket for their usual meeting. Elijah settled down cross-legged, carefully opening the book in his lap. Rosa glanced up from her knitting, her needles slowing as she watched the scene unfold. The morning light caught the silver in her hair as she smiled softly, then returned to her work, giving the children their space while keeping a watchful eye. Elijah began to read, his voice quiet but clear. He took his time with each word, sometimes pausing to sound out the longer ones. His finger traced under each line as he read, like someone had taught him long ago. "Once there was a fox who lived all alone in the woods," he began. He didn't mind being alone. At least that's what he told himself. But sometimes, when the wind blew through the trees at night, he wished he had someone to talk to. June leaned forward in her wheelchair, completely absorbed. Her hands rested still in her lap, her usual fidgeting forgotten as she listened to every word. The story unfolded slowly, carefully, in Elijah's steady voice. The fox in the story lived by himself until one day, a little bird started visiting his den. At first, the fox was suspicious and tried to chase the bird away, but the bird kept coming back, bringing small gifts, a shiny pebble, a perfect feather, a spring flower. As Elijah read, his voice grew more confident. The morning sun climbed higher, casting dappled shadows through the leaves onto the pages. A gentle breeze carried the sweet scent of nearby flowering bushes. When he reached a pause in the story, June spoke softly, her voice thoughtful. "Do you live alone?" Elijah's fingers stilled on the page. He didn't look up, but after a moment, he nodded. "For now," he added quietly, his voice carrying a weight that seemed too heavy for his young shoulders. June didn't press further. Instead, she reached out and touched the page gently, tracing the illustration of the fox and the bird. The bird didn't give up, she observed, even when the fox was scared. Elijah nodded again, and they returned to the story. Rosa's knitting needles continued their gentle clicking in the background, providing a soothing rhythm to the morning. When the story was finished, June sat quietly for a moment, processing. Then she carefully reached into her backpack and pulled out half of her sandwich, offering it to Elijah with a smile. He accepted it with a small nod of thanks, and they ate together in comfortable silence. Later that evening, June sat at the dinner table with Vincent, pushing her peas around her plate with unusual focus. Vincent watched her, noting how she seemed lost in thought. "How was your day?" he asked, his voice carrying its usual careful neutrality. June looked up, her face brightening. "Elijah brought a book today," she said, "about a fox who was all alone until a bird started visiting him every day." Vincent's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "Oh?" "The bird brought the fox presents just like I do with Elijah," June continued, her voice growing animated. "And at first the fox was scared and didn't want to be friends. But the bird kept coming back." She pushed her plate aside slightly, leaning forward. "I think he's the fox," she said thoughtfully. "But maybe I'm the bird." Vincent tried to smile, but something caught in his throat, making the expression falter. "Maybe," he managed to say, his voice slightly rough. June returned to her dinner, humming quietly to herself, but Vincent's appetite had disappeared. He sat there, watching his daughter, seeing something he hadn't noticed before, or perhaps hadn't wanted to notice. The way she carefully arranged her peas, the thoughtful tilt of her head, the gentle determination in her movements, all of it reminded him so much of her mother. After June had gone to bed, Vincent stood in his study, staring at the large safe built into the wall behind his desk. The house was quiet, filled with the kind of stillness that made thoughts too loud to ignore. With slightly unsteady hands, he entered the combination and opened the heavy door. Inside, among important documents and valuable items, sat a small leather-bound journal. He hadn't opened it since his wife's death, but he knew exactly where it was. The leather was soft under his fingers as he lifted it out, carrying it to his desk. The journal's pages were filled with his wife's flowing handwriting, notes about June as a baby, thoughts about parenthood, hopes for the future. But it was the note tucked into the front cover that he sought now. He unfolded it carefully, the paper thin and delicate with age. In his wife's familiar script were the words that had haunted him for years. "Don't let her grow up in a house full of quiet." Vincent stared at the words for a long moment, then slowly closed the journal. The sound seemed to echo in the empty room, a reminder of all the silence he'd allowed to grow around them. The morning sun cast long shadows across the park's winding paths as Rosa wheeled June back toward home. The little girl seemed quieter than usual, her right hand resting in her lap, partially hidden by her purple scarf. Rosa hummed softly, pushing the wheelchair with practiced care over the uneven spots in the sidewalk. Back at the house, Rosa helped June into her room for a change of clothes before lunch. As she helped June remove her light jacket, she noticed a small red mark on the girl's palm. Her heart skipped a beat. "Dios mío, what happened to your hand, mi amor?" Rosa gently took June's small hand in hers, examining the shallow cut that ran across her palm. June didn't pull away, her expression calm and matter-of-fact. "I just fell," she said simply. "He helped me up." Rosa's brow furrowed as she looked more closely at the cut. It had been cleaned, and someone had carefully placed a small adhesive bandage over it. The work was neat, almost methodical. "Tell me what happened, pequeña," Rosa said, keeping her voice steady despite her concern. "I wanted to see the ducks closer," June explained. My wheel got stuck on a rock, and I slipped trying to push myself. Elijah saw me fall. He helped me right away and cleaned my hand with his water bottle. He had a bandage in his backpack. Rosa noticed how June's voice carried no fear or distress, only a simple acceptance of what had happened and appreciation for the help she'd received. Still, Rosa's hands trembled slightly as she helped June change into fresh clothes, knowing how Vincent might react. The afternoon light was streaming through the windows when Vincent came home early from work. He stopped by June's room as he always did, his usual greeting dying on his lips when he spotted the bandage on her hand. His face darkened instantly. Without a word, he turned and strode toward the staff quarters, his footsteps echoing sharply through the hallway. He found Rosa in her small sitting room folding laundry. "What happened to my daughter's hand?" His voice was tight with barely controlled anger. Rosa set down the towel she was folding, meeting his gaze steadily. "She had a small accident at the park this morning." "An accident?" Vincent's voice rose. "That boy was there, wasn't he? What did he do to her?" "Senor Hale," Rosa said firmly, standing up straight. "Elijah did nothing wrong. In fact, he helped her when she fell. He cleaned the cut and bandaged it properly. He protected her." "Protected her?" Vincent laughed harshly. "She wouldn't need protecting if she wasn't around him in the first place. This ends now. No more visits to the park. No more contact with that boy. I want security doubled around the property." "Please, senor," Rosa tried to reason with him. "June has been so much happier since—" "I don't care," Vincent's shout echoed off the walls. "I'm not risking my daughter's safety for some street kid's friendship. This is over!" Neither of them had noticed the small shadow in the doorway. June sat in her wheelchair, her face pale, hands gripping the armrests so tightly her knuckles were white. Without a sound, she turned and wheeled herself away from the argument. The house grew quiet as evening settled in. When Rosa brought dinner to June's room, the plate remained untouched. June lay curled on her bed, silent tears rolling down her cheeks as she clutched the worn copy of The Lonely Fox's Friend to her chest. Rosa's heart ached at the sight, but she knew better than to push. She simply sat on the edge of the bed, gently stroking June's hair until the little girl's breathing evened out in sleep. In his office, Vincent sat alone in the growing darkness. The only light came from his desk lamp, casting a harsh glow over the papers scattered across his desk. The purple rock, the one Elijah had given June weeks ago, sat prominently among the documents, its painted swirls seeming to mock him. He picked up the rock, turning it over in his hands. The paint was careful, deliberate, not the work of someone violent or careless. He remembered June's words about the story. "I think he's the fox. But maybe I'm the bird." His jaw tightened as he set the rock down again. The silence of the house pressed in around him, reminding him of his wife's written words. Don't let her grow up in a house full of quiet. Finally, Vincent reached for his phone. His fingers hovered over the keypad for a moment before he pressed the familiar speed dial. "James," he said when his driver answered, "I need you to take me somewhere. Yes, now. The shelter on 4th Street, the one Rosa mentioned last week. I know it's late, but this can't wait until morning." He stood, pocketing the purple rock as he grabbed his coat. The house remained silent as he walked through it, but now the quiet felt different, less like protection and more like a wall he'd built himself, brick by brick. The last thing he saw before closing the front door was June's wheelchair, sitting empty in the hallway, a silent testament to all the barriers that existed in their lives. Some physical, some of his own making. Vincent's black SUV pulled up to the curb outside Hope Haven Youth Shelter, just as the streetlights flickered to life. The building was a weathered 3-story brick structure, its windows casting warm yellow squares onto the darkening sidewalk. A hand-painted sign hung above the entrance, its edges chipped, but the letters still clear. All are welcome here. James, his driver, cleared his throat. "Would you like me to wait, sir?" Vincent nodded, his fingers absently touching the purple rock in his coat pocket. "Yes, this shouldn't take long." The shelter's front desk area was cramped but meticulously organized. Mismatched chairs lined the walls, and a corkboard displayed community announcements and children's artwork. The air smelled of cleaning supplies and tonight's dinner, something with tomatoes and herbs. A few volunteers moved through the space, clearing paper plates and offering seconds to the handful of teens still finishing their meals. One young boy swept the floor with careful concentration, while an older girl helped wipe down tables. Behind the front desk, a woman in her 50s looked up from her paperwork. Her eyes widened with recognition. "Mr. Hale?" She stood quickly, smoothing her worn cardigan. "I'm Sarah Martinez, the evening supervisor. We weren't expecting... we usually schedule donor visits during regular hours." Vincent stepped forward, his expensive shoes clicking against the linoleum floor. "Vincent Hale," he said formally, though she clearly knew who he was. "I'm not here about donations. I need information about one of your residents." Sarah's expression shifted subtly, protective, guarded. "I see. Perhaps we should speak in the office?" She led him through a narrow hallway decorated with children's artwork and motivational posters. They passed a small library where 2 volunteers were helping younger kids with homework, and a recreation room where some teens played cards at a scratch table. The director's office was small but tidy. A desk lamp cast a warm glow over stacked files and framed certificates. Sarah gestured to a chair across from the desk, where another woman, older, with silver hair and kind eyes, was reviewing documents. "This is Margaret Chen, our director," Sarah introduced them. "Margaret, this is Vincent Hale." Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly, but her voice remained calm. "Mr. Hale, what brings you to Hope Haven this evening?" Vincent sat, his posture rigid. "I'm looking for information about a boy. His name is Elijah. He's 8 years old. No last name that I know of." The 2 women exchanged a quick glance. Margaret leaned forward, her expression careful. "Yes, we know Elijah. He's been in and out of our care for the past 1.5 years. "In and out?" Vincent asked. Sarah nodded. "He refuses to stay inside most nights, prefers the park bench, though we've tried everything to convince him otherwise. But he comes by almost daily, helps with the younger children, brings water to new arrivals, keeps the peace when tensions rise." Vincent's brow furrowed. "Why won't he stay inside? It's not safe out there." Margaret opened a drawer and pulled out a thin file. "Elijah's story is complicated. About 1 year ago, he formed a strong bond with one of our youngest residents, a toddler named Maya. She was only 3, newly arrived, terrified of everything. Elijah became her protector. He'd read to her, draw pictures for her, make sure she ate." She paused, her fingers tracing the edge of the file. Then one day Child Services found a placement for Maya, a good home, loving parents. But it was sudden. Elijah didn't even get to say goodbye. 3 days later, he disappeared. When he finally showed up again weeks later, he wouldn't come inside. Just started sleeping on that park bench. "He's not angry," Sarah added softly. "That's what breaks my heart. He's just decided not to trust permanence anymore. Walls mean commitment. Commitment means loss." Vincent sat very still, his hand unconsciously moving to his coat pocket where the purple rock rested. "The drawings," he said suddenly. "I've seen him draw." Margaret nodded and opened the file. She carefully removed several pieces of paper and laid them on the desk. "These are some he left behind for Maya. We couldn't forward them. No contact information for her new family." Vincent leaned forward to look. The drawings were simple but careful, done with what looked like borrowed crayons and pencils on whatever paper was available. A house with a bright red door and flowers in the windows, a sun rising over mountains, a huge tree with spreading branches that seemed to offer shelter. "He draws what he thinks people need to see," Margaret said quietly. "For Maya, it was safety, warmth, protection." Vincent stared at the drawings, his expression unreadable. After a long moment, he stood abruptly. "Thank you for your time." "Mr. Hale," Margaret called as he reached the door. "Elijah's a special child. Whatever your interest in him, please remember that." Vincent paused but didn't turn around. He nodded once and left, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. The night air was cool when he stepped outside. James opened the car door, but Vincent didn't immediately get in. He stood for a moment, looking back at the shelter's warm windows, at the children visible through them, doing homework, playing games, living their lives in this temporary home. Finally, he slid into the car's leather interior. Home, James. As they drove through the quiet streets, Vincent didn't speak. He stared out the window at the passing city lights, his hand in his pocket, fingers wrapped around the purple rock with its carefully painted swirls. In the shelter's windows, he'd seen what Elijah had drawn for Maya: safety, warmth, protection. The same things June saw in the boy who refused to sleep indoors. The same things Vincent had been trying to build with walls and security systems and rules. The same things that kept slipping away. The morning sun cast long shadows across the breakfast table, where June sat quietly pushing scrambled eggs around her plate. Vincent watched her from behind his untouched coffee, his phone silenced, and meetings canceled for the second day in a row. The usual morning bustle of the house felt muted, as if everyone was holding their breath. Rosa moved efficiently through her morning routine, but her eyes kept darting between father and daughter, noting the heavy silence. She refilled June's orange juice without being asked, her hand briefly resting on the little girl's shoulder. Vincent cleared his throat, then set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. The small sound seemed to echo in the quiet dining room. June looked up, her fork pausing mid-motion. "June," he said, his voice softer than usual. He pushed back his chair and moved around the table, the expensive fabric of his casual sweater rustling as he knelt beside her wheelchair. At eye level with his daughter, he could see the wariness in her expression, the slight tension in her small shoulders. "I'm going out for a while this morning," he began, watching her face carefully. "But before I do, I need to ask you something important." June's hands folded in her lap, her breakfast forgotten. She waited, patient and serious in that way that sometimes made Vincent's heart ache. No 5-year-old should be quite so good at waiting for bad news. "What would you say," he continued, choosing his words carefully, "if we invited Elijah here to stay with us?" The change in June's expression was immediate and dramatic. Her eyes widened and color bloomed in her cheeks. For a moment, she looked exactly her age, young and full of hope. But then, remarkably, she seemed to collect herself. Her small face grew serious again, thoughtful. "He doesn't like big things," she said slowly, as if sharing an important secret. "Maybe just one room." She glanced around at the high ceilings and expensive furnishings. "Not too much." Vincent felt something shift in his chest. Pride, perhaps, at his daughter's careful consideration of another's feelings. Or maybe recognition of how much he still had to learn from her. "We'll keep it small," he promised, and meant it. Rosa, who had been pretending to busy herself with the breakfast dishes, smiled quietly to herself. Later that afternoon, Vincent drove himself to the park. No driver, no security detail, no pressed suit. Just a man in a sweater and jeans, looking for a boy who had somehow become important to his daughter's happiness. He found Elijah by the bench, but not sitting on it. Instead, the boy was helping an elderly man gather fallen branches from the recent storm. Vincent watched for a moment as Elijah methodically collected the smaller pieces while the old man handled the larger ones. They worked in comfortable silence, no words needed between them. Vincent approached slowly, making sure his footsteps were audible on the path. Elijah looked up, his expression guarded but not fearful. The elderly man nodded politely and continued his work, sensing this was a private conversation. "Hello, Elijah," Vincent said, stopping a respectful distance away. Elijah straightened up, still holding a bundle of small branches. "Hello," he replied quietly. Vincent took a deep breath. "We have space at the house," he said simply. "Not for show, just for shelter." He gestured vaguely toward the bench. "Better than this." Elijah's eyes narrowed slightly. "Why now?" The question hung in the air between them. Vincent could have given many answers, about safety, about proper care, about what society expected. Instead, he chose the truth. "Because she hasn't smiled until you came back," he said, and I'd like to try being someone she smiles at too." Elijah looked down at the branches in his arms, then carefully added them to the pile the old man had gathered. He brushed off his hands on his worn jeans, thinking. Vincent waited. He understood now that this boy needed time. Time to process, time to decide, time to trust. The morning sun warmed their shoulders as they stood in this moment of possibility. Finally, Elijah took a step forward. He didn't speak, didn't nod, didn't make any grand gesture of acceptance. He simply moved closer to Vincent, ready to follow. They walked to Vincent's car in silence. No promises were made, no conditions set, just footsteps in sync, leading away from a lonely bench toward something new. The drive home was quiet but not uncomfortable. Elijah looked out the window, watching the neighborhood pass by. His small backpack, containing everything he owned, sat at his feet. Vincent kept his eyes on the road, letting the silence be what it needed to be. As they pulled up to the house, Vincent saw Rosa waiting at the front door. She stood straight and dignified, but her eyes were warm. And there, on the wide front porch, sat June in her wheelchair. Her face lit up as the car came to a stop, and her arms were already opening wide before Elijah had fully stepped out of the vehicle. Elijah walked up the path slowly, taking in the sight of the big house, the careful gardens, the expensive cars. But his eyes stayed focused on June, as if she were the only familiar thing in this new landscape. When he reached her, their hug was longer than usual. June's small arms wrapped around his neck, and for a moment, they were just two children holding on to something real. Vincent stood back watching. He saw how his daughter's smile reached her eyes for the first time in weeks. He saw how Elijah's shoulders relaxed, just slightly, as June whispered something only he could hear. He saw Rosa dabbing at her eyes with the corner of her apron. And he saw perhaps for the first time what his home could be, not just a showcase of success, but a place where smiles could grow and trust could build, one quiet moment at a time. The evening sun cast long shadows across the Hale Estate's manicured lawn as Rosa led Elijah toward the guest house. It was a small building, set apart from the main house but still within easy view of the kitchen windows. The structure had a simple charm that contrasted with the mansion's grandeur. One room, with warm brick walls and climbing ivy, that made it look like it had grown naturally from the garden. Rosa walked slowly, matching Elijah's hesitant pace. She noticed how his eyes darted around, taking in escape routes and hiding spots, habits that spoke of hard-learned lessons. When they reached the door, she handed him a simple brass key. "Would you like to open it?" she asked gently. Elijah took the key, turning it over in his hands before carefully fitting it into the lock. The door swung open with a soft creak. Inside, the room was modest but welcoming. A twin bed with fresh linens sat against one wall, topped with a handmade quilt in shades of blue and green. A small wooden desk occupied the corner by the window, complete with a lamp and a cup of newly sharpened pencils. Built-in shelves lined another wall, filled with books of various sizes. Some worn paperbacks, others newer hardcovers, but none too pristine to touch. Rosa stayed in the doorway, giving Elijah space to explore on his own. He moved carefully through the room, his worn sneakers silent on the wooden floor. His fingers trailed along the desk's smooth surface, then ghosted over the book spines. He paused at a collection of art books, their pages filled with landscapes and nature scenes. "Dinner is at 7 in the main house," Rosa said softly. "But you don't have to come if you're not ready. No pressure." She smiled warmly. "The bathroom is through that door, and there are clean towels on the shelf. Everything here is yours to use." Elijah nodded, still taking in his surroundings. His small backpack looked even tinier when he set it on the bed. Rosa noticed he didn't open it or start unpacking, another habit of someone used to quick departures. "I'll leave you to settle in," she said, stepping back. "If you need anything, just come to the kitchen door. Anytime." As Rosa walked back to the main house, she saw June watching from her bedroom window. The little girl's face was pressed against the glass, her breath leaving small clouds of fog on the pane. The sun was setting when June appeared at Elijah's door, carefully balancing a tray on her lap as she maneuvered her wheelchair. She knocked softly, then called out, "It's me!" Elijah opened the door, surprise flickering across his face. The tray held 2 bowls of steaming mac and cheese, the kind with extra cheese bubbling on top, and a plate of perfectly sliced red apples arranged in a fan pattern. "It's my favorite," June announced, wheeling inside. "We can eat on the floor if you want. Rosa put a special cushion on my chair so I can reach." Without hesitation, Elijah helped her arrange everything on the floor near the bed. He grabbed the extra pillow to make her more comfortable as she carefully lowered herself from the wheelchair. They sat cross-legged, the tray between them like they were having a private picnic. The familiar food seemed to loosen something in Elijah. As they ate, he spoke more than he had in all their park meetings combined. His voice was soft but clear, no longer carrying the edge of wariness it usually held. "I like your tree pictures," June said between bites, pointing to one of the art books he'd left open on the desk. Elijah nodded, swallowing a mouthful of mac and cheese. "I like drawing trees," he said. "They're strong even when it's windy." His fingers traced the outline of a giant oak in the book. "They bend, but don't break, and they're good at waiting." June tilted her head, considering this. Waiting for what? "Spring," he said simply. "Or birds. Or someone to sit under them." From the main house, Vincent stood at the kitchen window, watching the warm light spill from the guest house windows. He could see the 2 children's silhouettes, heads bent together over their meal, comfortable in each other's presence. Rosa moved quietly beside him, drying dishes with practiced efficiency. "You're doing the right thing," she said softly. Vincent's hands gripped the counter edge. "Am I? Everything in me says this is a risk." "You're not fixing her," Rosa replied, her voice gentle but firm. "You're giving her space to grow." She set down her dish towel and turned to face him fully. "Sometimes that means letting other people in, even when it's scary." Vincent watched as June's laugh carried faintly through the evening air. It was a sound he hadn't heard in so long. He'd almost forgotten what it felt like to hear it. Later that night, after June had been wheeled back to the main house and the lights dimmed, Elijah stood in his new room. The silence felt different here. Not the exposed quiet of the park bench, but something softer, more contained. He pulled a piece of chalk from his pocket. He'd found it earlier, half buried in the garden path. Moving quietly, he stepped outside. The security lights cast a gentle glow on the guest house's brick wall. Elijah studied the surface for a moment, then began to draw. His strokes were sure and practiced, creating the outline of a small tree. Not large or showy, just enough to be his mark. Roots reaching down, branches stretching up, simple but strong. When he finished, he stepped back to look at his work. The white lines seemed to glow slightly in the darkness. It wasn't much, but it was his. The first mark he'd made on this place that might become home. The next morning, June was the first to see the tree. She wheeled herself out early before breakfast, while dew still sparkled on the grass. Her face lit up when she spotted Elijah's drawing. Without hesitation, she pulled a yellow crayon from her chair's side pocket. She always carried art supplies now, and carefully added a bright sun above the tree's branches. The morning light caught the yellow wax, making it shine like a real sunrise over Elijah's chalk branches. 2 different marks, made hours apart, coming together to create something new. Sunlight filtered through unfamiliar curtains, casting gentle patterns across Elijah's face. His eyes snapped open, heart racing as he found himself in a real bed instead of his usual park bench. The soft pillow felt wrong, the warm blanket too heavy. For a terrifying moment, his mind couldn't place where he was. Then, through the window came the sound of June's laughter, bright and clear in the morning air. The panic in his chest began to ease. Memory returned slowly. The guest house, the mac and cheese dinner, the chalk tree on the wall. This was his room now, his bed, his space. Elijah sat up slowly, running his hands over the quilted blanket to ground himself. The room looked different in the morning light, less mysterious, more real. His backpack still sat unopened on the corner of the bed, but somehow it didn't seem as necessary as it had yesterday. June's laugh rang out again, followed by Rosa's gentle voice. Elijah moved to the window and saw them in the garden. June was in her wheelchair, pointing excitedly at something while Rosa tended to some flowers. The morning sun caught June's hair, making it shine like copper. A soft knock at the door made him turn. Vincent stood in the doorway, already dressed for the day, but looking somehow less formal than usual. He held a folder in one hand. "Good morning," Vincent said, his voice careful and measured. "I hope you slept well. Would you join me for breakfast? There's something I'd like to discuss." Elijah nodded, quickly pulling on his worn hoodie over his t-shirt. He followed Vincent to the kitchen, where Rosa had laid out plates of scrambled eggs, toast, and fresh fruit. June waved enthusiastically from her place at the table, her therapy exercises forgotten for the moment. As they ate, Vincent opened the folder. "I've been in touch with Riverside Elementary," he said, sliding some papers across the table. "They have a partnership with the shelter program. They're willing to enroll you immediately." Elijah's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. His eyes darted to the papers, class schedules, supply lists, and worst of all, a uniform policy with pictures of crisp navy blazers and pressed khaki pants. "I don't do uniforms," he said quietly but firmly, pushing the papers back. Vincent surprised him by chuckling. "That's what I thought you might say." He pulled out a different set of papers. "I've already spoken to the principal. Wear what you want. Just learn something new. That's all I'm asking." June perked up at this conversation. "My friend Katie goes there," she exclaimed. "She says they have the best art room ever." Elijah picked up the new papers cautiously. The school wasn't far, walking distance from the estate. The class list included art, music, and something called environmental science that involved studying local trees and wildlife. His fingers traced the edge of the paper, considering. "You don't have to decide right now," Vincent added, his tone surprisingly gentle, "but the option is there when you're ready." After breakfast, Rosa took June to her physical therapy session. Through the car window, Elijah watched them drive away, feeling a strange mix of emotions he couldn't quite name. He wasn't used to people leaving and coming back. Usually, he was the one doing the leaving. But June did come back 2 hours later, her face flushed with effort but beaming. Her therapist helped her from the car, commenting on how well she'd done today. "She pushed herself harder than usual," the therapist told Rosa, loud enough for Elijah to hear from his spot near the garden. "Really focused on her upper body exercises." "Why the extra effort?" Rosa asked June. June's answer was simple and clear. "So I can catch up to my friend." She looked directly at Elijah when she said it, her smile unwavering. The day passed quietly. Elijah spent most of it exploring the grounds, always keeping the guest house in sight. He found himself returning to look at his chalk tree several times, touching the rough brick wall where he'd drawn it. As evening approached and the sky turned soft purple, he found Vincent in his study. The door was open, but Elijah still knocked hesitantly on the frame. Vincent looked up from his computer. "Everything all right?" "Can I?" Elijah paused, gathering his courage. "Can I repaint the tree? With real paint? Outside the guest house?" Vincent's expression shifted slightly. "Why?" Elijah's fingers played with the hem of his hoodie, but his voice remained steady. "Because maybe this place gets to stay." The words hung in the air between them. Vincent studied him for a long moment, then gave a quiet nod. "I think we have some exterior paint in the garage. Let me check." 20 minutes later, Elijah stood before the wall with June beside him, both of them armed with paintbrushes. Vincent had found several colors of weather-resistant paint, and Rosa had brought out old sheets to protect the ground. The twilight air was cool and sweet as they worked. June painted the lower branches she could reach from her chair, her strokes careful and deliberate. Elijah worked on the trunk and higher branches, making them stronger and more defined than his chalk version. They painted in comfortable silence, broken only by the soft swish of brushes and the occasional murmur of suggestion or approval. The security lights came on automatically as darkness fell, illuminating their work. The tree seemed to glow against the white wall, no longer just a temporary mark, but something meant to last. Vincent watched from the kitchen window, his usual evening coffee forgotten in his hands. Rosa stood beside him, folding dinner napkins with practiced ease. "Look at them," she said softly. "They're painting their own story." On the wall, the tree took shape. Elijah's strong lines merged with June's playful additions. Not perfect, but alive with possibility. Each brushstroke said what words couldn't. This is home. This is family. This is where we grow. The morning sun painted long shadows across the estate's manicured lawn as Elijah shouldered his backpack. It wasn't his old, worn one. Vincent had insisted on getting him a proper school bag, though Elijah had chosen the plainest one he could find. Inside, new notebooks and pencils waited, still smelling of fresh paper and possibility. He paused at his reflection in the guesthouse window. The clothes were his own choice: clean jeans and his familiar hoodie, now properly washed and mended by Rosa's careful hands. His hair was neatly trimmed, though he'd refused anything too drastic. The face that looked back at him seemed different somehow, still cautious, but less haunted. The sound of wheels on concrete drew his attention. June was already on the front porch, waiting in her usual spot. Her smile brightened when she saw him, and she waved enthusiastically, a piece of paper clutched in her other hand. "I made this for your first day," she announced as he approached. She held out the drawing with pride. Elijah took it carefully. It was their tree, the one they'd painted together on the guesthouse wall, but June had filled its branches with colorful birds of all sizes. Some were flying, others perched together in groups. At the bottom, she'd written in careful letters, "Birds always know where home is." "Thank you," he said softly, carefully rolling the paper and tucking it into his bag. The morning ritual of meeting June on the porch had become something he looked forward to, a quiet moment of connection before facing the wider world. Rosa appeared in the doorway, holding June's breakfast smoothie. "The driver's ready when you are, Elijah," she said warmly. "And don't forget your lunch." He nodded, accepting the paper bag she handed him. Inside, he knew he'd find a sandwich, cut diagonally the way he liked, an apple, and probably one of Rosa's homemade cookies. The consistency of these small kindnesses still surprised him. Vincent's car pulled up right on schedule. Before heading down the steps, Elijah bent to give June their usual hug. She squeezed him tight and whispered, "You're going to do great." The school day passed in a blur of new faces, classroom rules, and trying to remember where everything was. His teachers were kind, if a bit uncertain how to handle him at first. During art class, he found himself sketching birds, inspired by June's drawing. When the final bell rang, he emerged into the afternoon sunlight to find June waiting with Rosa and Vincent in the car. June was practically bouncing in her seat. "Can we go to the park?" she asked as soon as Elijah climbed in. "Just to visit, not because we need to." Vincent glanced at Elijah in the rearview mirror, then nodded. "I think that would be appropriate." The park looked different in the warm afternoon light, smaller somehow than when it had been his whole world. The old bench sat empty, its worn wood catching the sun. Nearby, ducks paddled lazily in the pond, unbothered by the passage of time or changing circumstances. Elijah walked toward the bench slowly, aware of June watching him from where Rosa had parked her wheelchair on the path. From his pocket, he pulled out a small folded note, wrapped carefully in a rubber band. He placed it in the corner of the bench, tucked just out of sight. "I don't live here anymore," he said quietly, more to himself than to the others, "but I'll come back for the ones who do." June reached for his hand when he returned to the path. She didn't ask what he'd written in the note. She understood that some things needed to stay private, even between friends. While Rosa helped June feed the ducks, Vincent drew Elijah aside. "I wanted to show you something," he said, pulling out his tablet. He opened a series of architectural drawings, mobile units with beds, showers, and small living spaces. "It's something I've been working on." Elijah studied the designs with interest. They weren't like typical shelter buildings. These were smaller, more personal, designed to move where needed. "We're calling it the Porch Initiative," Vincent explained. "The idea is to provide temporary shelter without institutional walls, a place where people can find their feet without feeling trapped." "Like the porch where June and I meet in the mornings," Elijah said, understanding dawning in his eyes. Vincent nodded. "Exactly. Sometimes the most important moments happen in those in-between spaces. Later that evening, after dinner and homework, Elijah returned to his room in the guest house. The space felt properly his now. A few drawings on the walls, his clothes in the dresser, his school books on the desk. The painted tree outside his window had weathered its first rain without fading. On his bed, he found something unexpected, the Fox and Bird storybook he'd shared with June. But it wasn't the torn paperback anymore. It had been professionally rebound in soft blue cloth, the title picked out in silver letters. With careful fingers, he opened the cover. Inside, in clean printed text, were the words, "Not all homes are built, some are grown." Below that, a simple signature, V. Elijah ran his fingers over the words, feeling the slight indentation they made in the paper. Through his window, he could see lights on in the main house where June was probably getting ready for bed. The security lights illuminated their painted tree, its branches reaching toward the darkening sky. He placed the book carefully on his nightstand, right next to June's bird drawing. Tomorrow morning, he would meet her on the porch again. They would share their quiet moment before the day began, two people who had found each other in an unexpected place. But tonight, in this room that was now his, Elijah simply sat and watched the stars appear above their tree. Each one seemed to whisper what he was finally beginning to believe. You are home, you are home, you are home. The spring morning arrived with gentle determination, pushing away winter's last whispers. Sunlight spilled through new leaves, casting dappled shadows that danced across the estate's grounds. Birds called to each other in the gardens, their songs carrying through the quiet morning air. Vincent sat in his usual chair by the window, but his laptop remained closed beside him. Instead of checking emails or reviewing reports, his attention was fixed on the scene unfolding on the front porch. Through the large bay window, he watched as June held open a book while Elijah knelt beside her wheelchair. "Your shoe's coming loose again," Elijah said, his voice carrying faintly through the glass. He reached down with practiced ease, carefully retying the lace of June's sneaker. His movements were deliberate, gentle, the same way he handled his art supplies or helped younger kids with their homework at the shelter where he now volunteered on weekends. June nodded, not looking up from her book. "Thanks. Can you help me with this word?" She pointed to something on the page. "It's a tricky one." Elijah finished with the shoelace and shifted to see the book better. "Let's sound it out together," he suggested, his voice patient. The morning sun caught the silver threading in his hoodie, a birthday gift from June, who had insisted on adding artistic details to his favorite piece of clothing. Vincent watched as they worked through the word together, their heads bent close over the book. June's finger traced each syllable while Elijah guided her through the sounds. Their voices were low, comfortable, the kind of quiet that comes from trust rather than fear. From the kitchen doorway, Rosa observed the scene with knowing eyes. She pulled out her phone, capturing the moment without fanfare. June's small hand gesturing at the page, Elijah's careful attention, the morning light wrapping around them both. The photo wasn't staged or perfect. Dishes from breakfast still waited in the sink, and June's hair was slightly messy from sleep. But it held something more valuable than perfection. Rosa glanced at Vincent, still at his window perch. 2 months ago, he would have been buried in work by now, using meetings and calls to fill the silence that had haunted the house since his wife's death. But something had shifted. The quiet wasn't an enemy anymore. It had become a space where new things could grow. Later that afternoon, while June was at physical therapy, Elijah stood before the guest house wall where their first tree stretched its branches toward the sky. He uncapped a fresh can of paint, the color matching the original perfectly. With steady strokes, he began creating a second tree beside the first. This new tree grew slightly taller than its companion, but as Elijah worked, the branches began to weave together. Where the first tree had stood alone, now its limbs intertwined with its neighbor, creating patterns of light and shadow in the spaces between. The work was careful, intentional, each brushstroke adding to the story they were all still learning to tell. When June returned from therapy, her face bright with achievement from mastering a new exercise, she wheeled straight to the wall. Elijah had just finished the final touches. Without a word, she pulled out her red crayon, the same one she'd used since their first meeting, and drew a single bird in the space where the two trees met. The bird wasn't perfect. Its wings were slightly uneven, and its tail feathers stuck out at odd angles, but it belonged there, bridging the gap between separate things that had grown together. As evening approached, the sky softened into shades of purple and gold. Vincent stepped onto the porch, not to check on June or deliver a message, but simply to sit beside her wheelchair. It was something he'd never done before, this quiet sharing of space without purpose or plan. The wooden porch steps creaked softly as Elijah emerged from the guest house. In his hand, he held something small that caught the fading light. He crossed to where Vincent sat and held out his palm. A rock rested there, similar to the purple one he'd given June months ago, but this one was painted in careful strokes of gold. The paint seemed to glow in the twilight, like a piece of sunset caught in his hand. Vincent looked at it, then at Elijah. "What's this one mean?" he asked, his voice quiet but clear. Elijah's answer was simple. "It means you stayed." 3 words that held months of small moments. Breakfast conversations that grew longer each day. Homework help offered without being asked. A father learning to listen instead of fix. Vincent took the rock, feeling its weight in his palm. Solid, real, like the changes that had reshaped their lives. They sat together in the growing dusk, a man who had hidden from his own grief, a boy who had run from loss, and a girl who had shown them both how to stay. Behind them, 2 painted trees shared their branches against the white wall. No newspapers had written about their story. No crowds had gathered to witness their healing. It had happened in quiet moments, in daily choices, in the steady work of becoming family. The evening birds called their last songs. A cool breeze carried the scent of Rosa's garden. And on the porch, 3 people who had found each other by accident sat together in the kind of silence that feels like home. Some mornings begin with noise, others begin with quiet, but the best ones begin with someone waiting at the porch. I believe stories like this find us for a reason. If this one touched you, please subscribe. I share a new one every day, and tomorrow's might be the one your heart's been waiting for.